In the summer of 1962, a boy in rural Tennessee left his back porch at 7 in the morning with a piece of buttered bread in one hand and a jar in the other. He did not come back until the supper bell rang. His mother did not know where he was for most of those hours. She was not worried. She knew he was somewhere between the creek and the train tracks, somewhere with the other boys, somewhere doing the work that childhood used to be. When he came home, his knees were skinned, his pockets held 3 smooth stones and a piece of copper wire, and his jar held 2 lightning bugs and a sleeping beetle. He set the jar on the windowsill above the kitchen sink. His grandmother looked at it without saying a word. She had raised 5 children of her own, and she understood the jar. The jar was the proof of a day well spent. The jar was the trophy of a boy who had been outside for 10 hours and who had used every one of those hours. That boy is now in his 70s. His own grandchildren have never filled a jar. They have never come home with skinned knees from a creek. They have never stayed outside until a bell called them in. What they have, instead, is a glass rectangle that lights up their faces in a dark room, and a mother who knows exactly where they are every minute of the day, and a kind of tiredness that no amount of sleep seems to fix. This video is about 30 things American children did every single day before any of that started. 30 ordinary activities that filled the hours between breakfast and supper. 30 small acts of imagination, exploration, and physical exhaustion that built the bones and the minds of the last generations of American children who grew up without a screen in their hand. Some of these will be familiar. Some have been forgotten. All of them were once as normal as breathing. This channel exists for one reason: to remember how American families lived, raised their children, kept their homes, and held each other together before all of it was lost. If you believe the way children used to play is worth remembering, take a moment to subscribe. It costs nothing, and it tells this channel that someone out there still cares whether these stories get told to the children who never lived them. Begin with the 30th activity, the one furthest from the heart of the matter, and walk slowly toward the first. Number 30. Walking to the store with a note and a coin. A mother in West Virginia in 1955 would hand her 7-year-old a folded piece of paper and a quarter, and tell him to walk the 4 blocks to the corner grocery and bring back a pound of butter. He did. He walked alone. He crossed 2 streets by himself. He spoke to the grocer, an older man who knew his mother's name. He paid, he counted his change. He carried the butter home in a small brown paper sack, and he was proud of it the whole way back. That errand was not a chore. That errand was the first time a child was trusted with the running of the household, and he carried that trust home in his pocket along with the change. Number 29. Catching lightning bugs in a glass jar with holes punched in the lid. Every summer evening in the Midwest, in the Carolinas, in rural Pennsylvania, children would come out onto the lawn at dusk with empty mason jars their grandmothers had washed and saved. Their fathers would punch the holes in the lid with a nail and a hammer. The children would chase the small green lights across the grass for an hour, sometimes 2, until the jar glowed in their hands like a held star. They would set the jar on the bedroom windowsill and watch it until they fell asleep. In the morning, they would let the bugs go. No child was ever told to do this. No parent ever organized it. It happened every summer in every town because that was what summer evenings were for. Number 28. Building a fort from scrap wood, old blankets, and whatever else could be dragged out of the garage. A boy in Missouri in 1968 spent 3 weeks of his summer building a fort behind the tool shed out of 2 warped 2x4s, a sheet of corrugated tin his father had let him have, an old quilt his grandmother said had been her mother's, and a length of rope. The fort had a roof that leaked. The fort had a door that did not close. The fort was the most important building that boy had ever stood inside. He sat in it for hours. He read comic books in it. He ate sandwiches in it. He invited 2 friends inside and made them swear an oath he had written himself in pencil on the back of a feed store flyer. No adult was involved in any of it. No adult was meant to be. Number 27. Marbles in the dirt during recess. Every American schoolyard from the 1930s through the 1960s had a worn patch of bare earth somewhere along the fence, and that worn patch was where the marbles were played. Children brought their marbles to school in cloth bags with drawstrings their mothers had sewn. They had favorites. They had names for them: a cat-eye, a steely, a cleary, a swirl. They lost them and won them and traded them with a seriousness that no modern child has been allowed to bring to anything. A boy might walk home with 3 more marbles than he came with, and that small economy was his first experience of fortune and loss. He did not need a phone. He had a bag of glass spheres and a square of dirt. Number 26. Riding a bicycle until the streetlights came on. The rule was the same in every American town. You could go anywhere on your bicycle, you could be gone all day, but you had to be home when the streetlights came on. That was the curfew, and every child obeyed it because the streetlights were the only authority that mattered. A girl in suburban Ohio in 1972 rode her bicycle 3 miles from her house most afternoons, to a friend's yard, to a small pond at the edge of town, to the woods behind the elementary school. She came home with the bottom of her jeans damp, and her hair tangled and a scrape on her elbow. Her mother did not ask where she had been. Her mother knew she had been somewhere on her bicycle, and her mother knew she would be back when the lights came on, and she always was. Number 25. Playing kick the can in the alley until full dark. The game required nothing: an empty soup can, a handful of children, a patch of pavement or grass. One child was it and guarded the can while the rest hid. The point was to sneak in and kick the can before getting tagged. It was tag and hide and seek and capture the flag all at once, and it could go on for 2 hours in the dim blue light of a summer evening, with mothers calling from porches all up and down the street, and children pretending not to hear for one more round. Number 24. Climbing a tree until somebody's mother yelled. A child in Wisconsin in 1958 had a favorite tree. Every child did. It was an old maple in the side yard of a neighbor's house, and it had a fork in the trunk about 8 feet up that was perfect for sitting in. She climbed it almost every day in the summer. She read books in it. She watched the street from it. She fell out of it once and broke her wrist and was back in it 3 weeks later with the cast still on. Her mother eventually came outside and yelled at her to get down. She did, and then she climbed it again the next morning. Number 23. Making mud pies in the corner of the yard. The youngest children, the 4-year-olds and the 5-year-olds, spent whole mornings at the edge of the garden with an old pie tin and a wooden spoon and a hose. They mixed dirt and water and called it baking. They decorated the pies with dandelion heads and pebbles and bits of grass. They set 'em out on the porch railing to bake in the sun and waited for their grandmothers to come out and pretend to eat them. The grandmother always pretended. She would lift the imaginary slice to her mouth and chew, with great seriousness, and say it was the finest pie she had ever tasted. The child believed her. That belief was the foundation of something that no toy ever built. Number 22. Drawing on the sidewalk with chalk. A box of colored chalk cost a dime in 1955, and one box would last an entire summer. Children drew flowers, names, houses, hopscotch grids, and elaborate maps of imaginary kingdoms across the concrete in front of their houses. The rain washed it away every few days, and they started over. The starting over was part of it. Nothing on a sidewalk was ever supposed to last. That was a lesson a child absorbed without ever being told. Number 21. Hopscotch with a bottle cap as a marker. A girl in New Orleans in 1948 played hopscotch every afternoon after school on the sidewalk, in front of her grandmother's house. The grid was drawn in chalk her aunt had brought home from the schoolhouse. The marker was a flattened soda bottle cap. The rules were the rules every American girl knew, with regional variations passed mother to daughter. She played until her grandmother called her in for supper. There was no equipment to buy. There was no app to download. There was a piece of pavement, a piece of chalk, and a piece of metal, and there was the whole afternoon. Stop here for a moment and consider something. The food industry has spent 50 years figuring out how to replace the way American children used to eat. The entertainment industry has spent 20 years figuring out how to replace the way American children used to play, and the second project has been more successful than the first. A grandmother in West Virginia could still teach her grandson to make biscuits from flour and lard if he came to visit her, and he would learn. But that same grandson handed a piece of chalk and turned loose on a sidewalk would not know what to do. The instinct has been trained out of him. He has been raised to wait for somebody to entertain him. He has been raised to consume play instead of make it. And what was lost in that change was not just an afternoon. What was lost was the muscle that lets a child sit with empty time and turn it into something. That muscle, once it goes, is very hard to grow back. Number 20. Building a soapbox derby racer in the garage with a father. Across America in the 1940s and 1950s and into the 1960s, every town had a hill, and every hill had a derby day, and every boy spent the weeks beforehand in the garage with his father and a few scraps of plywood and an old set of wagon wheels. The cars were terrible. The cars barely held together. The cars were the finest thing those boys had ever made because they had made them with their fathers, and the splinters in their hands and the grease on their jeans were the proof of it. A boy who has built something with his father knows something about himself that no amount of store-bought confidence can replace. Number 19. Playing jacks on the kitchen floor while supper cooked. A girl in Nebraska in 1952 would sit cross-legged on the linoleum with a small red rubber ball and a handful of metal jacks while her mother stood at the stove stirring beans. She played for 30 minutes, an hour, picking up onesies, twosies, threesies, all the way to tensies, with the steady rhythm of the ball bouncing on the floor like a small heartbeat under the conversation of the kitchen. She did not need to be entertained. She did not need her mother to talk to her. She was content to play at her mother's feet, in the warmth of the stove, with the smell of beans and onions in the air. That was an entire universe. That universe is gone. Number 18. Catching crawfish in the creek with bare hands. Boys in rural Alabama in 1965 went down to the creek behind the church on Saturday afternoons with a bucket and nothing else. They turned over flat stones in the shallow water and grabbed the crawfish before they could scoot backwards. They came home with a bucket of them, and their mothers boiled them with salt and a pinch of red pepper, and the boys ate them with their fingers on the back porch as the sun went down. That was supper. That was the catch. That was a boy bringing food to his family from a creek and feeling for one evening that he was a man. Number 17. Jumping rope in the driveway with a long clothesline. A pair of sisters in Pittsburgh in 1959 took the spare clothesline out of the basement every afternoon in the summer and turned it for each other in the driveway. They sang the rhymes their mother had taught them, which their grandmother had taught their mother. Cinderella dressed in yellow, down in the valley where the green grass grows. Teddy bear, turn around. They jumped until they were out of breath and then they switched. They did this for an hour at a time, sometimes longer. They were getting stronger every day, and they did not know it, and that was the point. Strength used to be a side effect of play, not the goal of an exercise routine. Number 16. Playing pretend with a cardboard box. A refrigerator box was a treasure beyond measure. When the appliance store delivered a new icebox to a neighbor's house in the Carolinas in 1961, every child on the street showed up to claim the box. It became a fort, a spaceship, a covered wagon, a submarine, a cave, a tiny house. Children spent days inside it. Children cut windows in it with their father's pocket knives. Children painted it with poster paints they had saved from school. The box lasted until the first rain. The box was the finest toy that Street had seen all year. The box cost nothing. Number 15. Reading a library book under the back porch. A child in rural Tennessee in 1948 walked to the small county library on Saturday mornings and came home with 3 books in a canvas bag. She read them under the back porch where the dirt was cool and the cobwebs hung in the corners, and her mother could not find her. She read all summer that way. She read books she did not fully understand. She read books that were too old for her and books that were too young. She read everything because there was nothing else to do in the long, hot afternoons, and because the library was free, and because reading in the dim coolness of the porch shadow was its own kind of pleasure that the modern child has never tasted. Number 14. Walking the railroad tracks to see how far it went. There was a moment in every American childhood, somewhere between the ages of 9 and 12, when the child walked the railroad tracks past where they were supposed to go. A boy in West Virginia in 1957 walked them with 2 friends for 4 miles past his grandmother's house, just to see what was there. They balanced on the rails. They threw stones at telegraph poles. They put pennies on the track for the train to flatten. They came home filthy and starving and alive in a way that no organized activity could have made them. The track was not safe. The track was not supposed to be safe. The track was the first place a child went to find out who he was when no adult was watching. If you grew up doing any of this, leave a comment and tell where you are from and what your favorite of these was. This channel reads them. The names of these games change from town to town, and the memories of them are scattered across this country. And the comments section under videos like this one is one of the only places where they are still being gathered up. Add yours to the pile. A boy in Texas might have called it something different than a girl in Maine. That is part of the record. That is part of what is being saved. Number 13. Making a swing out of a rope and a tire. A father in rural Missouri in 1953 came home one Saturday with a length of thick rope and an old tire from the back of his truck. He tied the rope around a high branch of the oak tree in the side yard and threaded it through the tire, and that was the swing. It lasted 12 years. His 3 children swung on it. His grandchildren swung on it later. He had not bought a set. He had not assembled anything from a box. He had taken 2 things that were already there and made something his family would remember for half a century. Number 12. Playing marbles in a chalk circle. Different from the dirt game at school, this one happened on the sidewalk in front of a child's own house, with a chalk circle drawn just so, and the rules a little different. The point was to knock the other player's marbles out of the circle with your own. You kept what you knocked out. You could lose all your marbles. You could lose your best marble, and then you had to walk home and tell your mother, and she would say, "Well, that is the game." And it was. Number 11. Building a snow fort in the front yard in winter. Children in Wisconsin and Minnesota and upstate New York spent entire Saturdays in the snow, packing walls 4 feet thick, hollowing out chambers, building battlements. They came inside only when their hands hurt too much to move. They peeled off their wet wool mittens at the back door, and their mothers had hot chocolate waiting in mugs on the kitchen table, and they sat there shivering and red-cheeked and triumphant. The fort would still be there in the morning. They would be back in it. The cold did not matter. The wet did not matter. The fort mattered. Number 10. Playing Red Rover in the side yard with all the neighborhood children. 2 lines of children holding hands, calling each other across. Red Rover, send Annie right over. Annie ran. Annie tried to break through the line. Annie either broke through and got to take a child back to her side, or she failed and joined the other team. The game went on until somebody got hurt or somebody's mother called them in. Children learned what their bodies could do. Children learned how to take a hit. Children learned that the other side was not the enemy, only the other side, and that after the game everybody walked home together. Number 9. Skipping stones across the pond. Every boy and girl in America who lived near water learned this, and the learning was always the same. An older boy or an uncle showed how to pick the flat stones, how to hold them with the thumb on top and the index finger curled around the edge, how to throw sidearm with a flick of the wrist at the very end. The first attempts plunked straight in. Then a child got 2 skips, then 4. Then, on a perfect day, on a perfect pond, 11 skips, and the child stood on the bank in disbelief at what their own hand had just done. Number 8. Watching the clouds and naming the shapes. A child in Nebraska in 1955 lay flat on her back in the grass of her grandfather's farm for an entire afternoon and looked at the clouds. She named what she saw: a horse, an old man with a beard, a whale, a castle. She did this alone. Nobody asked her to. Nobody told her she was being mindful or practicing imagination or developing her brain. She was a child on the grass on a summer afternoon, and her mind was free, and that was an unremarkable thing. It is now an almost extinct experience. A modern child cannot sit still in the grass for 15 minutes without reaching for something to look at. A child who can lie in the grass for 2 hours and watch clouds has a soul that has been left alone long enough to learn its own shape. Stop and think on this for a moment. What was lost when the screen replaced the cloud was not just an afternoon. It was the entire silent middle layer of a child's mind. Children used to have hours every day in which nothing was happening to them. No voice was speaking. No image was changing. No notification was pinging. In those hours, the child's own mind had to come forward and entertain itself. And what it did to entertain itself was build the imagination, the memory, the inner voice, the patience, and the ability to be alone without panic. Modern advice tells mothers that boredom is a problem to be solved with another app, another show, another tablet, but the bored child was never the problem. The bored child was where the soul did its slow, invisible growing. We have taken away the boredom, and we have wondered why our grandchildren cannot sit still, cannot read a book, cannot wait in a line, cannot bear their own company for 5 minutes. The answer was in the cloud. Number 7. Playing hide-and-seek in the gathering dusk. The light is going. The air is cooling. Mothers are starting to call from the porches up and down the block. And in that last hour of daylight, every child in the neighborhood is in somebody's yard, pressed against the side of a garage, crouched behind a hedge, holding very still under the rhododendron, listening to the seeker count. The thrill of being found is exactly equal to the thrill of not being found. The body remembers it 60 years later. The smell of the cooling grass, the sound of a screen door slamming 3 houses down, the soft tag of a hand on a shoulder, and the run for the home base. That was a Tuesday in 1963. There were 1,000 of them. Number 6. Playing house with old dish towels and pots. Girls in every American kitchen of the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s set up a corner of the back porch as their own house. They had an overturned crate for a table. They had a cracked plate their mother had given them. They had an old wooden spoon and a dented pot. They cooked imaginary suppers. They served imaginary husbands and imaginary children. They were practicing, although they did not know it, for a life their grandmothers had lived and their mothers were living. The game was not a cage. The game was a rehearsal of competence. The girl who played house at 6 was the woman who could run a household at 26. The connection between the two has been severed in modern life, and we wonder why young women now feel that adulthood has been kept from them. Number 5. Carving small things out of soft wood with a pocket knife. A grandfather in the Ozarks in 1949 gave his grandson a small folding pocket knife on the boy's 8th birthday. He showed the boy how to whittle a stick to a point. He showed the boy how to carve a small fish, a small bird, a small face. The boy cut himself 3 times the first month. The grandfather did not take the knife away. The grandfather wrapped the cut with a handkerchief and said, "That is how you learn." The boy kept the knife for the rest of his life. He carved hundreds of small wooden things over the years and gave them to his children and his grandchildren, and not one of those carvings sits in a landfill. They sit on mantels. They sit on bedside tables. They sit in the hands of the great-grandchildren of that grandfather, who never met him, but who hold a small wooden bird that he carved with his own hands. A pocket knife and a piece of pine. That was the start of it. Number 4. Helping with the garden and getting paid in a glass of cold lemonade. A child in the Carolinas in 1955 spent Saturday mornings pulling weeds in the vegetable patch behind her grandmother's house. She was 6 years old. She was paid in lemonade from a sweating glass pitcher on the back porch table, and a piece of pound cake under a cloth napkin, and the praise of her grandmother, who said she was the best little helper there was. That child grew up knowing the difference between a weed and a tomato plant. That child grew up knowing that work and reward were connected. That child grew up knowing that the food on the table came out of the dirt, and that the dirt was the work of her own small hands. She did not need a class on responsibility. She had pulled the weeds. She had eaten the cake. The lesson was inside her bones for the rest of her life. Number 3. Listening to grown-ups talk on the front porch after supper. This was not an activity in the usual sense. It was a presence. After supper in the warm months, the grown-ups sat on the front porch in the cool of the evening with their coffee and their iced tea and their slow conversation. The children sat on the steps below them, or on the porch floor, or on the lap of an aunt, and they listened. They did not interrupt. They did not have to participate. They simply absorbed. They heard their fathers and their uncles and their grandfathers talk about the work week, about the weather, about a neighbor who was sick, about a cousin who had moved away, about a war that had ended 15 years ago and still came up some nights. They heard their mothers and their grandmothers talk about who was getting married, who was having trouble, who needed a casserole brought over on Sunday. The child on the porch step was learning the entire culture of his family without anyone teaching him a thing. The child was learning what mattered by hearing what the grown-ups talked about. That kind of slow, accidental, generational education has almost no place in the modern American home. The porches are empty, the conversations are typed. The children are upstairs with their faces lit up by a screen, and they are missing every word. Number 2. Walking to a friend's house and knocking on the door with no warning. There was no calling ahead. There was no texting. There was no asking permission 3 days in advance through a parent's group chat. A boy in suburban Ohio in 1968 simply put on his shoes after breakfast and walked the 6 blocks to his best friend's house and knocked on the screen door. The friend's mother came to the door. She said, "Come on in. He is in the back." The boy went through the kitchen, where she was kneading bread, and out the back door, where his friend was throwing a ball against the side of the garage. They played the rest of the morning together. Neither of them had arranged anything. Neither of them had been driven anywhere. The whole social life of childhood ran on the simple act of walking somewhere and knocking on a door. The friendships made that way were different from the friendships managed by parents through scheduled playdates. They were owned by the children themselves. They were the children's own work and the children's own treasure. And they lasted decades because the children had built them with their own feet on their own sidewalks. Number 1. Coming home when the streetlights came on, dirty and tired and full of a whole day. This is the activity that contained all the others. This is the heart of what has been lost. An American child between roughly 1930 and roughly 1985 lived inside a daily rhythm that started at breakfast and ended at the streetlights. Between those 2 points, the day belonged to the child. The child filled it, the child shaped it, the child came home at the end of it with mud on his shoes, a stick in his hand, a bruise on his shin, a story he would tell at the supper table, and an exhaustion that meant he slept the moment his head touched the pillow. He had spent 11 hours doing whatever a child does when nobody is supervising him. He had run, he had climbed, he had built, he had imagined. He had argued with other children and made peace with them. He had been afraid and brave and bored and inspired in the same afternoon. He had been a child in the full and ancient sense of the word, and his body and his mind had been built by the doing of it. He came home filthy and free. He ate the supper his mother had made. He fell asleep in clean sheets, and he got up the next morning and did it all over again. That was the childhood. That was the whole of it. That was the thing. And here is the quiet truth at the end of all of this. The childhood that produced the strongest generation of Americans this country ever raised was a childhood almost entirely free of adult management. The mothers were nearby, but not hovering. The fathers were working, but not absent. The grandparents were on the porch, but not directing. The children were left alone for hours of every day, and in those hours they built themselves. They built the kind of selves that survived a depression, won a war, raised families, and held communities together for 40 years afterward. We have replaced that childhood with one in which a child is supervised, scheduled, entertained, and watched almost every minute of every day. And we are surprised that the result is a generation that cannot bear to be alone with itself for 10 minutes. The hours of nothing were not wasted. The hours of nothing were where the strength came from. We have taken the nothing away, and the strength has gone with it. Here is the small thing to do this week. Pick one of these 30, just one. Find a child you love, a grandchild, a niece, a nephew, a neighbor's boy, and show it to that child. Hand him a pocket knife and a piece of pine. Take her down to a creek and show her how to turn over stones. Give them a mason jar with holes punched in the lid and walk outside with them at dusk. Do not film it. Do not post it. Do not photograph it. Just do it the way it used to be done in the quiet of an ordinary afternoon. One child learning one thing from one older hand. That is how it survives. If you found something worth keeping in this video, subscribe so the next one finds you. Share it with somebody who would understand it. A sister, a cousin, the friend you grew up climbing trees with, the brother who built the fort with you in the woods behind the house, and in the comments, leave the name of one thing you used to do as a child that no child in your family does anymore. Just the name. A game, an errand, a chore, a small adventure. That is how these stories survive. One name at a time, in one comment section, on one quiet channel that still cares. That is how they lived. That is what they had. That is what we can still give back, one child at a time before the last of it is gone.